This is the Education Exchange with Paul Peterson. I am the director of the program on education policy and governance at Harvard University. Thank you for joining us. COVID has changed the politics of school choice. When schools went digital, many parents and politicians began to wonder whether the schools were doing their job. And the plethora of new private school choice programs spread across red state America. Charter school enrollments began to pick up. Homeschooling doubled in size. But has the public in general embraced these changes, or are many of these changes the product of strategic maneuvering among legislative elites? A new paper on school choice referenda was just presented at an international school reform conference that I attended in Rome, Italy, just this past week. And it takes a close look at this question. So I'm pleased to have with me on the Education Exchange one of the authors of the paper, Vlad Kogan. He's a political science professor at Ohio State University, and some of you have heard him on prior podcasts, especially the one where he's talked about his new book, No Adult Left Behind. But today we're going to talk about the school choice elections. So Vlad, thank you for joining me on the Education Exchange.
Thanks for having me back, Paul, and it was great to see you in Rome.
Well, Vlad, there have been a dozen or more elections in which private school choice has been on the ballot. In every case, a majority of the voters have turned down the school choice option. So that says to me school choice is not very popular. Why is this not popular among the public at large?
Yeah, so the best guess that we can offer based on our analysis is really a kind of a two-part answer. One goes back to really an argument that Terry Moe made more than 20 years ago, that there exists what he calls a public school ideology, that most voters really think about schools not necessarily based on the quality of the education they provide, but because they care about having public schools. So I think that's part one. And then part two, I think in the context of campaigns around vouchers in particular, one of the most powerful messages that comes through is that vouchers risk taking money away from traditional public schools. And because of that public school ideology, that proves to be an incredibly powerful message that really dramatically drives down support and really causes these measures to be defeated on election day. And as you mentioned, that has been true for every single statewide ballot referendum we've seen going back to 1978.
Well, I find it a little unsatisfying to be say there's a public school ideology and everybody believes this ideology and they support the public schools and they vote things down because we usually think of ideologies as being conservative or liberal or socialist or fascist. It's a broader concept than just a single issue like this. So is this properly understood as an ideology, or is it better understood as the public supports the institution that they know well because that's where they went to school? And why would you want to change what you already have?
Yeah, it's a great point. I'm not wedded to the term ideology, but I think it's a little bit deeper than people have gone to public schools and therefore they want to keep the system as it is. I think the reality is, for most voters, there's actually some self-interest there. And I think this is something that often gets lost in the debates about school choice. And I think it's actually one area where school choice advocates go a little bit wrong, which is that the modal voter, whether in a high turnout election or in a low turnout election, does not actually have school age kids. So for them, their self-interest is not about the quality of the education. Their self-interest is going to be affected by things like property values. And so if your home value partly reflects the quality of your public schools, you are quite rationally concerned about how any policy, including school choice policy, is going to impact those public schools because that's going to hit you in the pocketbook. And so I think that's really, I think, the core issue, that for most voters, it's not about the quality of the education their kids get, but it's all the other reasons, quite rational and reasonable reasons, for why they actually have a vested interest in keeping their public schools in their community as vibrant and as well funded as they can be.
Well, that all makes sense. But then when we look at survey research, that tells us that public support for school choice is pretty high. I mean, these education savings accounts, this new idea that's come down the pike, is getting support from the public at around 65, 70%. And tax credits have a roughly similar level of support. Vouchers often are up there getting majority support or at least clear plurality. among those who are asked questions in the survey. Can we believe these surveys?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and that in some ways is our motivating puzzle. That you're right. If you look at surveys, vouchers and school choice and ESAs are incredibly popular. And yet, when it comes to actual revealed preference on election day, when there's actual consequences to those opinions, that support erodes dramatically. And I think the reason why is that, and this is again something that Terry Moe showed more than 20 years ago, is it's one thing to ask people in the abstract, do you think vouchers are a good idea? I think it's another to ask them, do you think vouchers are a good idea if they come at the expense of and if they hurt your traditional public schools? And I think that is the common theme we see in the three ballot initiatives we study, is that becomes the core message of voucher opponents. They say, you might like the idea in principle, but think about what this is going to do to your traditional public schools. Think about all the money that this is going to take away from traditional public schools. And I think it's very, very hard to kind of replicate that campaign environment, that messaging in the context of a poll. I know EdChoice folks have tried and they do survey experiments, but even those experiments, I think, don't fully capture how powerful that message is. And I think that's why surveys, although probably accurate in what they're measuring, are not a good predictor of the decisions voters actually have to make after they're exposed to these very well-funded campaigns.
A lot of my friends in the school choice community, they say, well, that's because the opposition makes things up and says that, oh, you're going to have terrorist schools, Islamic schools, you're going to have all kinds of extremism in education, you're going to have the money taken away from public schools. They don't have much evidence to support this, but they make these claims and they scare people to death. Isn't it just they're being, people are being scared in these campaigns?
That may be, I mean, partly true. And again, I think it'd probably take a whole podcast to kind of fact check some of these claims. And I think you're right that they're generally exaggerated. I do think they have some elements of truth, and we can talk about that. But regardless, I mean, that's the reality, right? That's, democracy is about voters responding to the information environment they face. And regardless of how we feel, morally about the arguments being made, they are being made, right? So if you're a school choice advocate, you have to accept the reality as it is. And clearly, those arguments that are being made are working really well. So again, if you are somebody that's in favor of school choice, clearly whatever counter messaging has been offered in these campaigns has not worked, right? So clearly, we have to think about what's driving voter behavior. And again, if you are an advocate and supporter of school choice, think of a new strategy to address that. Given that your opponents are going to kind of come out guns blazing and use every argument they have, whether accurate or not.
Well, a very smart political scientist by the name of V.O. Key said many years ago that the one kind of of public opinion he believed in was latent public opinion. And he meant by latent public opinion, the opinion that's expressed on election day. You seem less sure about opinions expressed in surveys. Is that your opinion?
I think that's right, especially on an issue like this, where there are kind of surface level intuitive considerations, and then there are deeper considerations that really I think are hard to draw out in a survey, but which campaigns do a great job of drawing out. So, there are easy issues where maybe that's less the case, but for these kinds of questions, I think it's really, really hard to design a survey that fully replicates what we would expect to see, at the end of a campaign cycle rather than just the beginning.
Now, some people say it's just partisan politics. The Democrats oppose school choice and they campaign hard. The Republicans are a bit divided on it. There's still a lot of opposition in rural America. And so if one party's sort of not sure and the other party's pretty strongly opposed, isn't that just mean defeat?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in fact, this was one of the big questions we wanted to answer. And just to back up, the three states we looked at were Colorado, Kentucky, and Nebraska, which all had school choice related referenda in November of 2024. And for us, that was a great election because that was a presidential election year. And so we observed not just how people voted on these measures, but we observed their partisanship, at least as reflected by their preferences in the presidential election. And so what we've done is we've gone through and really collected a near universe of precinct level data. And in Colorado, in fact, we have individual level data for about 2 million voters. And so we really dig down into this question, how much of this is partisanship? And maybe surprisingly, certainly for us and maybe to your listeners, is school choice, although it does break down along partisan lines to a certain extent, is far less polarized, far less partisan than some other culture war issues. Think about abortion, think about immigration. The partisan gap on school choice is far smaller than on those issues. And what's interesting for us is, we actually went back and we found a similar referenda in California 25 years ago in 2000, which was also a presidential election year. And what's fascinating is school choice in California in 2000 was roughly as polarized as it was in 2024. So not only is opinion and voting behavior on vouchers not particularly polarized, but it doesn't seem like it has gotten more polarized over this quarter century when we know in general partisan polarization has gotten much more extreme and affective polarization has gotten much more extreme. So far, it seems like school choice has largely been able to kind of avoid that dynamic.
How about rural schools and rural constituents? Does your detailed analysis suggest that there's more opposition in rural areas?
Yeah, it's a great question. That was certainly what we expected because that has been, a widely noted theme at the state legislative level. So when states have been considering creating voucher or ESA programs in places like Texas and Tennessee that are pretty red, we have seen a lot of divisions within the Republican Party on that rural non-rural divide. And the idea is that in rural areas, schools are big community institutions, they're big employers, and so that might bring about some opposition.
Oh,
And you
they got a
see
football team, they got a basketball team.
exactly.
Everybody likes to go to the Friday night game.
Exactly, exactly. And so you see that at the legislative level. What's interesting for us is we don't see that actually with voters. So it is the case that rural areas supported these school choice referenda at somewhat lower rates. So think somewhere, on the order of 1 to 2 percentage points, so a very small difference compared to suburban areas. But urban areas also saw somewhat lower support, roughly by the same margins. So it's not rural versus everyone else. It's mostly suburban versus everybody else, where school choice is most popular in the suburbs and least popular elsewhere. But again, these are really small differences, much smaller than, again, we would expect given the rural divide that we see, again, in places like Texas and Tennessee in the state legislative discussions and votes.
Well, a lot of people say that school choice is a race issue, that white people see this as something for black people, another government program that's going to be given out to a population that they feel has gotten too much already. So is this become caught up in the race politics of the 21st century?
Yeah, so we certainly can't speak to how voters perceive this issue, but what we do see, sort of consistent with part of that account, is it is the case that school choice is much more popular in areas that are heavily non-white. Across the three states, again, Colorado, Kentucky, and Nebraska, we see significantly higher support on these referenda in more heavily black precincts and in more heavily Latino precincts. And these are fairly sizable effects. So again, roughly of the same magnitude as the partisan gaps we were talking about earlier. So partisanship is important, but so is race. The conventional wisdom that minority voters are the ones who really demand school choice the most does play out in these votes. And again, there's a few other predictors as well that we can discuss if you want.
So what we can't really tell is that although minority voters are supporting school choice, whether that very support may be undermining support among some of the white voters.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. We can't speak to kind of what's motivating white voters, but I will say, in some of these campaigns, um, and certainly in Kentucky, some of the anti-voucher and anti-choice ads really, I think, kind of did try to play some race dog whistles. Kind of using words like urban, etc., to signal subtly to voters that maybe this is not going to benefit people like you, and maybe it's going to benefit people that don't look like you, and maybe potentially priming some of these racial considerations. But again, with our aggregate level data, unfortunately, we can't directly measure kind of the consequences of that messaging.
Well, now you have focused in here on private school choice. How about charter schools? Are they exempt from this kind of criticism? Let me remind you that in Massachusetts, the voters rejected an expansion of the charter school program. I think it was in 2018. And even though the charters are very successful in Massachusetts, so is this something that applies more generally to other forms of school choice?
I think it does. We had three referenda. Kentucky and Nebraska were very specifically about vouchers. Colorado was a little bit different. Colorado had a constitutional amendment that was actually a much broader proposal, really creating a right to school choice of all kinds, including charter schools, private schools, homeschools, open enrollment, and it even said future innovations in education that haven't been invented yet. And although, despite not being specifically about vouchers, the public opinion dynamics on that referenda were nearly the same. So again, the same partisan breakdown, the same racial breakdown, the same urban-rural suburban breakdown. Really, the only the only difference that we noticed between Colorado and the other two states was the importance of private schools. So in Kentucky and Nebraska, we did see lower support in areas that we call private school deserts, which are communities where there's really no private schools nearby. That was not true in Colorado. On the other hand, in both those states, Kentucky and Nebraska, we saw higher support in neighborhoods where people were already more likely to use private schools. We did not see it in Colorado, and so it does suggest that there are specific interests and specific interest groups and specific voters who see both costs and benefits that are unique to vouchers. But the broader dynamics that we've been discussing, for the most part, do seem like they apply more broadly, including for things like charter schools.
Well, the other side of this coin is, given the opposition that's demonstrated by voters in one election after another, why do we get so many school choice laws? They're passing in many states across the country. It's true they're mainly on the red state side, but the blue states have their charter schools. So why do we get school choice when there's plenty of opposition at the voting booth?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think we have to go back to I think the best evidence we have on what drives state policy in general. And so, about 15 years ago, Jeff Lax and Justin Phillips at Columbia had a great paper called "The Democratic Deficit in the States." And what they did in that paper is they went through and they counted the various policies that states had adopted, and then they went through and they measured public opinion. And if you thought public opinion was driving policy, you would expect a very strong relationship that in most places, on most policies, you would have majority support in favor of whatever states were doing. And in fact, that was not what they found. They actually found that public policy matched majority opinion only about 55% of the time, which was slightly better than a coin flip. I think the big takeaway from that was there's a lot of things that drive state legislatures and governors when they make policy that are really not about mass opinion. And I think that, these referenda suggest the same kind of dynamic happens with school choice as well. That this is really a story about, interest group mobilization, partisanship, and that's not necessarily driven by kind of voter demand in those states.
Well, it might be voter demand in primary contests because in Republican primaries, there may be a lot of support for school choice, and there may be donors who are contributing to candidates who are going to win in these primary contests. And you've got to win the primary to win the general. So could the driving force be primary elections, not general elections?
That's a great point. I think you're absolutely right, and that is certainly a dynamic that again we saw in Texas and Tennessee where governors were in favor of school vouchers, but they had a really hard time convincing their fellow legislators, including Republican legislators, to go along. And in both of those states, the governors did actively recruit candidates in primaries to basically run more pro-voucher candidates.
So what are the implications for the new legislation, the new federal legislation that was just passed in the one big beautiful bill? There's a clause in there that says each state can decide what they want to do with the new tax credits that are going to become available to individuals who want to take a tax credit instead of paying a certain portion of their taxes. So is that going to be affected by the dynamics you've identified here?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I would make two predictions. I think you're absolutely going to see a big partisan divide, similar to, I think, the divide about the Affordable care Medicaid expansion, and I think many people have kind of pointed to the parallels that partisanship is going to play a big role in whether states participate. And I think the other prediction is because this is likely to be branded a Trump program. I do worry that one of the consequences of states debating this issue is we are going to see much more polarization in mass opinion along partisan lines um, on an issue that so far has somewhat resisted that polarization. So that would be my other prediction that we will see mass opinion grow much more divided along Democratic Republican lines than it is right now.
Well, so those that's what can you say that's gives me more hope for the future than we're going to have more partisanship than ever before.
Gosh, yeah, we're definitely struggle to find to find hope, but I think understanding what drives opinion is really the first step to designing more effective campaigns, and so hopefully that is one direction that people can go based on the information we've uncovered.
Well, thank you, Vlad, for joining me on the Education Exchange. I really appreciate these insights that you have into the way in which the legislative process is disconnected from the actual voting behavior of people when something is on the ballot.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on.
I've been speaking with Vlad Kogan. He's a professor of political science at Ohio State University, and he's co-author of a recently released paper. He has two co-authors on the paper, Michael Hartney and Parker Baxter. And the title of the paper is The Politics of Private School Vouchers. It will be available on the Program on Education Policy and Governance website in the near future. And so thank you very much, Vlad, for joining me on the Education Exchange.
Thanks, Paul.
This is the Education Exchange with Paul Peterson. We release a new podcast every Monday at noon Eastern Time on the Education Next website.